Hello and welcome to Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. My name is Ben and with me is...
Jar Jar Binks.
You chose Jar Jar. I suppose retrospectively, there's honor in that choice.
Absolutely, there is. We're gonna talk Jar Jar.
And you chose Jar Jar Binks because we watched Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
And I don't know what your thoughts are, and obviously we're going to talk about that, but my thesis for this podcast is it is far better than anyone gives it credit for. So that's what I'm... Look at the eyes here. Look at them.
You got the crazy eyes.
I feel it in my bones, and I have come ready to argue this point against anyone who wants to say otherwise. So well, I'm ready.
I'm going to hold my opinion until you tell me about the trading of taxation routes.
I already don't like what you're doing here. All right. But look, this was obviously my pick, so therefore it is my task to deliver a succinct and functional synopsis of events. So here we go. Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn and his apprentice Obi-Wan Kenobi are sent to settle a trade dispute. Yes, they are. But they are ambushed and forced to flee. On the planet Naboo, they rescue Queen Amidala and befriend the clumsy but well-meaning Gungan Jar Jar Binks. Escaping the blockade, they land on Tatooine to repair their ship, where they meet Anakin Skywalker, a young slave with extraordinary Force potential. Qui-Gon believes Anakin may be the chosen one and wins his freedom through a high-stakes pod race. Back on Coruscant, political tensions grow as Senator Palpatine rises in power. The film then ends with a battle on Naboo, the defeat of Darth Maul, and the beginning of Anakin's Jedi training. And it also ends with a fantastic song that is diegetic in nature. For those of you who are film nerds, you know, you'll like that one.
The song's a bop. Okay. Let's get to the facts, and then we'll get into the movie. Released in 1999, directed by George Lucas of THX-1138 and American Graffiti fame. Written by George Lucas, starring Liam Neeson, Natalie Portman, Ewan McGregor, Jake Lloyd, Ian McDermott, Anthony Daniels, Kenny Baker, Pernilla August, and Frank Oz. Music by friend of the podcast at this point, John Williams. Runtime of 134 minutes.
You're very loose with the... Look, we might think that they're our friends,
we've mentioned him several times.
Yeah, we've mentioned him, but I think, John Williams may take issue with being called our friend.
I think he's a pretty cool guy.
Newsflash, we don't know him.
Nah, I know him. I feel him. His music tells me a lot. Runtime, 134 minutes. Budget, 115 million. Box office. Its initial run, 431,088,295. But with re-releases, it's just over $1 billion.
I feel like that 400 million figure, that's got to be domestic, right? That can't be international.
Domestic. Most of my numbers usually are domestic.
Right, okay.
Yes. So if you look up Wikipedia, it just says $1 billion. But when you break it down, is like its original domestic run was the 431 million, and then with like the 3D re-release and anniversary re-releases, it's close to $1 billion.
I'm pretty sure that at the time internationally it was 800 or 900.
Yeah,
for its worldwide gross.
It was huge.
I just mention it because for the time that was insanity. Like we're much more used to seeing those kinds of numbers now, but in 1999 the
only thing before that was like Titanic, where that had that number. Yeah, it's very much worth bringing up. I like the Phantom Menace. I mean, I have very openly in our friendship group ranked the Star Wars movies. I did a full rewatch last year, which I'm sure we can talk about. And it is my second favorite of the prequels. And it is probably in my top 5 of all of the movies. I think it is a very good movie. I think it suffers from what all the prequels suffer from, and that is some dead spots. But sheer nostalgia, pod racing, Duel of the Fates, this movie is always rewatchable to me and always fun. And I'll never hear an awful word said about it. At the time, there was a lot of people kind of feeling it was too kiddie. That's fine. I was 12. It was perfect for me. But yeah, I love this movie.
Yeah, I have always been a Phantom Menace defender, So as you say, we're the same age. So we were 12 when this came out. I remember vividly actually really liking the movie in the cinemas,
Yeah,
like just
loved
being like, wow, that's great. Like I was already a huge Star Wars fan because of VHS. VHS is an old form of media, kids, which
Jim, me and you became friends because of Star Wars.
That's true, actually. So look, I remember going to see the 1997 special editions at the cinema and thinking, wow, this is amazing. Get to see Star Wars at the cinema. And then I was in disbelief that there was actually more Star Wars coming out that was new. Never thought I'd see that. Thought it was sort of an old thing that we would never see. And then when we saw it at the movies, I was actually blown away.
Yeah.
I recall exiting the cinema and looking at my mother, and because I went with my mum and dad, and my mum was like, Jar Jar Binks, he was funny. He was so funny. And I remember looking to my father and I was like, Dad, what did you think of the movie? What did you think? Dad was like, it was okay. And my dad was the one who introduced me to Star Wars. And I remember thinking vividly, why didn't he like it more? Why didn't he, as what was then a 40-something-year-old man, why didn't he resonate with this film? And obviously, that was, I guess, my first tip-off that maybe older people at that point in time, remember, I'm 12, maybe older people didn't love it as much as I did. So I particularly remember thinking about Jar Jar Binks, and I thought he was funny. I thought he was really interesting as a character, and I thought that he was a character that I wanted to spend time with and really enjoyed. And it wasn't actually until a few years later, honestly, that I realized how many people and many critics didn't like the character at all and felt it was a bad fit for Star Wars. But I was oblivious to all of that because I thought it was great and I really enjoyed it. Interestingly, the thing that I struggled with a bit more was being 12 and looking at the way Anakin Skywalker spoke in the film. Obviously, being not that far removed from that age.
Wizard!
Hearing the yippee and the let's try spinning, that's a good trick. That was the thing that in the cinema for me, I went, that's a bit, I don't think that would happen. That was really the...
George Lucas has always been... he's never been really criticized for his big ideas, but he has been criticized for his ability to write certain things. One of those is children, and the other one is romance. He doesn't have that in his amazing tool bag, and he does have an amazing tool bag. He's a very talented man who's given the world a lot of wonder. But yeah, Anakin, look, I think two people in this movie are done incredibly hard by. Jake Lloyd and Ahmed Best.
Yeah.
Ahmed Best has come out the other end and is now a fan favorite and has done the full cycle. And poor Jake Lloyd had a much harder time surviving because he was a kid. Ahmed Best was at least an adult, but I mean, even he has a dark story about Star Wars and how he was treated by fans. And you're right. Jar Jar's fine. Absolutely fine. He's goofy. He's weird. But Star Wars has always had goofy and weird. Just when it came out when you were the appropriate age, it was the right type of goofy and weird for you. So yeah, it's always had it. It's always had it. And I've said this before in other Star Wars podcasts, Star Wars is for kids. And it happens to resonate with adults. And it's always been that way. I love Star Wars. I will watch anything Star Wars. I watch the series, I watch the cartoons, I watch the Ewok movies, I will consume it all. But it's not always for me anymore. I just need it because I'm a lore guy. I want the bits, right? But yeah, those two lore guys got hammered. But as you said, my story is similar to yours. I was a bit luckier. My parents actually bought me opening night tickets for midnight and surprised me with them. And took me into the city. I'd never been into the city to see a movie. I always saw my local movies. And there was 17 cinemas and every single one of them was showing Phantom Menace at midnight. And I thought everyone was dressed up. There were people with lightsabers. There were aliens. There were stormtroopers. The 501st, which if you don't know is like a charity group who does amazing Star Wars cosplay, were there. And that's the first time I was introduced to them. And it was the coolest experience. The crowd was hype. Everyone was hype. And you're right. I had no idea that anybody had any issue with Jar Jar Binks or anything in that movie. Everyone was so excited and so had the right energy that night. And you're right, a few years later, the internet becomes a bit more ubiquitous. I'm on it more. I'm on forums for Star Wars and things like that. And you start seeing that just this seemed to be unified front of Duel of the Fates is awesome. I love pod racing. Ahmed Best and Jake Lloyd are the worst things ever. And you're like, that's not fair.
No, it wasn't. And even as a kid, like I say, I didn't have any form of real criticism. It was more that I thought, oh, that's a bit odd, really. And really, that's as far as my quote unquote criticism went at that point in time.
Are you an angel?
Exactly. It didn't bother me all that much. I just thought, kids don't really speak that way, or at least no kids that I know of. Okay, hey, that's Darth Maul. And then I was on with the show kind of thing. You know,
Is that a second end to his lightsaber?
Exactly. It was really, which I think sort of sums up how I feel about the whole movie, which is to say that I actually think the movie is really good. I think the movie holds together. I think structurally it's sound. I think there's a lot going on. I think it's fascinating in terms of its history and detail as a world. And it's actually a glimpse, in my opinion. I've got some conspiracy theories here, but I think this is a glimpse into what we would have seen a lot more of in episodes 2 and 3 had the film actually been received differently, because there is so much in this movie that is almost historical, in the sense that I look at episode 1 as the first chapter in what could have been a fall of Rome sort of narrative. That's really what it looks like it was to me when we think about the Senate, even when we think about some of the bits and pieces that we get in episode 2, which were harkening back to the Colosseum. When we look at the design of Naboo in particular, when we look at the idea of the almost Shakespearean politics of it, I go, I think this was supposed to be a fall of the Roman Empire story where it crumbles from within, and we're there to witness that and that political treachery. And then obviously after episode 1, they really moved away from that, and everything became a lot more personal, a lot more familiar, a lot more individual character stakes, and we did lose some of that overall mythic, quasi-historical world building that we were seeing in episode 1. And I think that's one of the reasons that I like episode 1 so much, is because you really get that glimpse of where I think we were originally going with the prequels. And it's not to say I dislike what we eventually got with episode 2 and 3. There's a lot to like in those as well. But it is to say, a part of me kind of laments that if this was going where I think it was going, we could have seen something super unique in that second and third episode. So what do you think?
The history of Star Wars is an interesting topic, right? Because we have things that George Lucas has said, and then we have conjecture, right? And we get this kind of weird blend, and then you get this third category of people who are close to Lucas who say this is what he meant. And
can I just jump in there? I will let you finish, but I also just want to jump in on that and say, I love George Lucas to bits for creating all this stuff. I think we have enough evidence now to say he's kind of an unreliable narrator of his own work.
So, I was getting there. I was definitely getting there. Okay. You're right.
You go for it.
Because the things he said, he has revisioned history multiple times. He has changed his narrative to meet the pop culture around what it is, or he has deliberately changed his narrative to go against the pop culture at times. So we've got the original source, who isn't trustworthy. We've got conjecture, which isn't trustworthy. And we've got people who say that are close to Lucas, like Filoni and people like that, who say, no, this is what he told me. So you've got these kind of three strands of Star Wars history. Now, the accepted, at least beginning of the prequels, was he did 4, 5, 6, and he didn't want to do any more Star Wars after that. He was done. He was burnt out. And he kind of just wanted to he'd created these massive studios and industries around his projects. He wanted to produce things, and he wanted to keep doing those stuff. And then you kind of get this kind of Star Wars resurgence with like the Dark Horse comics and the Timothy Zahn books, right? And you kind of find this audience is still there. And The story I've seen a few times in a few different places is Lucas saw that and goes, well, I don't want to do sequels, but I have all this stuff I created to build my universe as prequels. And I could go back and tell the story of this Grand Republic. And, you know, he thought, well, I've got Anakin and I've got these people. And he went from that and he made these prequels, right? And another big inspiration for him was technology. He loves film and he loves film technology. And we were just entering the age of proper CGI sets and things like that.
And digital cinematography.
We
were right on the edge of that wave, which he was crucial in pioneering.
And just like James Cameron and other directors like him, they're like, I have an opportunity to pioneer this. I have an opportunity to push this, and I have the thing to do it with. People will watch Star Wars. So he sets about writing and doing his prequels. And you're right. I think there was a much more hard-nosed political story, and I think he backed off of whatever that was because of the backlash he got from episode 1. Because I made the joke, right? Oh, you know, a movie about trade sanctions. Because that's not my joke. That's the internet's joke. But you still see those crumbs, like you said, especially in like episode 3 when you get like the conversations between Anakin and Palpatine in the Senate, and watching the shows and the opera and there's all these kind of this kind of opulence that is around, and there's a war going around in the wider galaxy, very fall of Rome. So you're right. I believe that was probably there, but I also believe we'll never know.
Yes.
We'll never know for sure. And I think in a way, that has been to the benefit of Star Wars. People being able to go, we don't know, but it could be this, and it could be that. And the world is rich enough that just about any fan theory you come up with fits. Unless it's wild, but it fits, right? You can go, well, we got the comics, and we got the old books, and we got all this. It's interesting stuff. But Phantom Menace itself, I think, is important as a movie. I think it's really, really important. It was kind of the first of its kind in so many ways. The way it treated effects, but also like coming back to a story in such a large, directly connected way. He was bringing things to the light that had been dabbled on in other films, but he put it all into one place. And it was impressive. It was really, really impressive. And, you know, he gave us some of the most memorable Star Wars in that film itself. As I said before, the Duel of the Fates still blows my mind. The combination of the storytelling in that fight, the choreography, the action, the music behind it, and then the scenery itself. It's what people call cinema magic. That is cinema magic to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that Duel of the Fates is amazing. There's a lot of things about episode 1 that are amazing. The design of the entire film is incredible to me. So I love the design of, I think it's Utagunga, which is the underwater city. It's an incredible design for this underwater city. And it's really almost like every location that you go to has some more magnificent wow factor design. And at the time, we'd never seen any of these before, except for Tatooine, which is a desert planet. And yes, the design there is familiar, but really the rest of the film just has location after location that are all pretty mind-blowing, really, when you look at them. I do think it's really important. The way that I think it's important, look, episode 2 for me is the one that is technologically very important. He wanted to use digital cinematography on episode 1. The cameras weren't ready. So therefore, while it does have a lot of breakthroughs in CGI, and certainly in the amount of CGI per frame of the film, which was highly unusual for the time, the thing that episode 1 brings for me that I think is really unique is this film was made in kind of a vacuum. This is a perfect vision of what George Lucas wanted to show us. And for better or worse, that's exactly what he did. The money was his own. In a way, it's the biggest independent feature film of all time to that point in time, where he's putting up his own money. There's no one saying you can't do that except for himself. And then he goes and writes the script, and he does exactly what he wants to do, and then he delivers it in a way that obviously he hoped it would be universally loved. And you and I, sounds like we both think that he made adjustments based on the reaction to this film in a way that does make episodes 2 and 3 perhaps somewhat less pure. You could argue that it also might make them better. I'm also someone who is a person who goes, well, criticism's interesting, isn't it? Because in this case, George Lucas might not have had a studio head saying, we don't like that bit, don't do that. But he did have an audience that was telling him very clearly what they liked and didn't like about his first go around with this prequel trilogy, which again, I think he pivoted to for episode 2 and episode 3. Coming back here to what we're looking at, there are so many portions of this film that I just think really work. You know, first of all, the film gets an awful lot of flack for a few key things, and I do think some of it is actually completely unwarranted. The whole idea of trade disputes and boring politics where we talk about that doesn't actually occur in the film. It's a huge criticism of the movie. The movie opens by saying there's a trade dispute. The Jedi never actually negotiate that trade dispute. They sit in a room for 10 seconds and then get attacked. And then the rest of the first half hour of the film is just go, 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 action beat, action beat, action beat. And then as for the politics, where everyone says, oh, there's all this politics, there's one scene where Amidala petitions the Senate, calls for a vote of no confidence, which is a crazy move, by the way, if we actually think about that for a second. And then Palpatine the door is open for him to take that seat. And that's it in terms of politics for the movie. So it's interesting that criticism comes up time and time again, yet when we actually look at runtime, mostly we're doing Star Wars stuff where we're racing pods, we're, using lightsabers, we're getting rid of droids, we're doing action things, right? I would say that the Tatooine portion in the middle, yes, it drags. For me, at least, it drags. And I think it drags for a lot of people. We're doing some interesting work there and a little bit of what I would call plot gymnastics to get our pod racing to happen. We've got a bet, we've got a side bet, we've got a couple of gambles. Qui-Gon Jinn is just woo, 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 rolling with the punches. He's like, yeah, I'll bet on that. Yeah, I'll do that. He is a maverick. He's, Tom Cruise could learn a couple of things from Qui-Gon when he's getting in there with the bets on the pod races and trying to get things happening. But he is a smooth operator when it comes to making things happen in the way that he wants. So, and of course, yes, we have then some of the character work with Anakin, which he's not a huge part of the movie, to be honest. So again, it doesn't really bother me too much, but he's quite prominent in the finale. And yes, that is very implausible how that all works out. But again, I put my 12-year-old sunglasses on and I bumped on it a tiny bit at that age. It just didn't bother me all that much when I was that old. He was a conduit
of the Force.
Yeah, well, whatever he was doing, it was working out for him. Let's say R2 was really the main hero of that space battle.
It was R2. Yeah. Right? That makes the most sense, right?
He's in that starfighter at the end, right? And we don't know how much R2 is actually flying that thing. And then what we find out about R2 in later prequels, where he is basically a superhero, we can essentially pretty confidently say that R2's sitting there and with his little beeps and boops, he's basically just saying, you sit back, Anakin, I got this.
He's just nudging things.
I got this. I can do this. You have a nap in the back seat. Pretend you're flying. It's fine. Don't worry about it. I can do this,
Star Wars, and especially the Phantom Menace to me, will always hold that place in my cinema-loving heart. It changed. It fueled my love of cinema. Like, I hadn't lost it, but it definitely was a stoking of the fire. I very much couldn't wait for episode 2 and 3. I wanted to see them more than any other movie. And when each one was released, I was there day one. Like, I had to see it. I haven't had a yearning for films like that ever since. And it's not because those films were bad. I just think it was that moment in time. It was perfect for me. I texted you something during the week about this. I texted you one thing about this movie. What did I text you?
I can't remember. It's been a big week. What did you say?
I watched this movie, and it's the one thing I cannot believe they have not revisited in Star Wars.
You're going to have to tell me. pod racing, right?
They've put it in games and stuff like that, but how have they not made a pod racing Netflix series or Disney Plus series? Like an up-and-coming pod racer trying to join the circuit. That would be awesome. Like, you could do it as a cartoon or something. Like, they built this thing. They created this thing in this universe that is action-packed, fast, adrenaline-filled, can introduce a multitude of characters in and out as a rotating roster. I don't know if you've ever watched it. Netflix has that F1 series, Drive to Survive. And so basically it follows the F1 drivers through a year of F1 driving. They should do a fake mockumentary version of that for pod racing.
That would be pretty awesome. And I should say, if we're talking about pod racing, the whole idea of pod racing furthers my fall of the Roman Empire theory, because
chariots.
We're looking at chariots, right? We're looking at Ben-Hur. We're looking at that whole tradition there, but in Star Wars with a Star Wars spin. So
he's a slave driving a chariot for his freedom.
Yeah.
100%.
Here we are.
And George Lucas has been pretty open with influences, especially cinematic influences throughout his career. Like, he doesn't hide what he likes and what he kind of is influenced by. Like, he's mentioned, Japanese cinema. He's mentioned history in general as saying, like, yeah, of course, these are allegories for this and this or whatever. But yeah, you're right. It is very cool. I wanted to bring up something that I think gets overlooked until much later on in Star Wars canon. People call the first 6 movies like the story of Anakin Skywalker, right? I kind of disagree. Realistically, the driving force of all 6 of those movies are Sheev Palpatine.
Yeah.
It's his story. We just don't follow him because he's the villain.
Yeah.
And he doesn't kind of show up until, like, if you watch them in release order, till like partway through Empire as a hologram. But like Sheev Palpatine, the Emperor Palpatine, Sidious, Darth Sidious. Every single thing happens in this movie because he wanted it to happen. He didn't want Maul to die in the end, but it didn't bother him because he always had plans upon plans upon plans. I think as far as villains go, because of our sequel trilogy, he loses a bit of luster, but I think he may be one of the greatest cinematic villains of all time.
Yeah, and he's definitely the glue that holds the prequels together, because he's the one who is pulling all the strings, and we're seeing enough of that to actually track that throughout the 3 prequel movies. So I also think Ian McDiarmid is just a really good performer, and he was purpose-built for this role.
What serendipity, right? He does it in Return of the Jedi, and he's really young. They have to make him up to look old. And then by the time they make the prequels, he's the right age.
Yeah.
Like, just fits.
It is pretty amazing. So I think we should pivot a little bit, because I would worry that we're not doing our due diligence if we didn't really dive in here and say, okay, we've said that it's better than people give it credit for, but let's get into the weeds and say what's actually not good about it. So there's the internet, which is going to jump and pounce on a bunch of things, and maybe there's some stuff that's not justified. But at the same time, we are film critics. We've been doing this for a while. We understand how story mechanics work. What doesn't work about Phantom Menace, while we already know that we like it?
I have 3 definitive thoughts on this. You've brought up the first one. The pacing in Tatooine is poor. He's trying to get across some key information, and it feels a little clumsy and blocky. It's a bit too slow, and I think overly complicated in parts. Because he wanted to tell this story and get to pod racing and Anakin as the chosen one and things like that. And because Anakin as the chosen one actually isn't a major plot point of this movie, it's setting up future movies, there's too much time on it. The second thing I'd like to bring up is a plot piece, and that is midichlorians necessary. They are, and that is a wider analogy for a few things in this movie. He explains things that don't need explaining. We don't need to know why people have the Force. We don't need to know all these little bits of things. We don't need to know that Anakin was necessarily just conceived of the Force. There's some overcomplications in this movie that I think people thought were clever, or were explanations for lore that people probably wouldn't have even cared about if they weren't brought up. The last thing I'm going to bring up, and I think it's something they retroactively fixed, and it's something I was really bummed about at the time, was the end of Darth Maul. They created this character, this villain, that people just attached to. They thought he was by far the coolest thing in this movie, and the story had him being defeated, and in a way that he doesn't come back. It was fixed later on in Clone Wars through some mental gymnastics and the Force and all that sort of stuff, but for the canon movies, he never really returns. And I think, honestly, my childhood brain at the time thought that that was a mistake. I had 4, sorry. And the last one is clutter, especially on Tatooine, especially in some other places. Visual effects clutter. There were times where I think there was just too much. But there are times where I'm just like, a little bit of reality here would have really anchored this a little bit more. At the time as a kid, I did not think that. At the time as a kid, I was like, wow, amazing. But as an adult, where I've seen films blend real and CG to perfection, I think that that's a flaw in this. But I think it's more of just an overexcited, look what we can do, and things like that.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with a lot of that. Some of the things didn't bother me as much as they bothered you. Midi-chlorians was never a big deal for me. I don't care.
It killed me, man.
It doesn't worry me one way or the other, and I still, to this day, don't fully... Well, look, I do understand why people are upset about it, but it's literally just, it doesn't upset me that much. And so I move on from that. When I think about story mechanics, the things that you said that I resonate with, definitely that Tatooine section is overcomplicated. And not only that, but the solutions to story problems have really implausible outcomes. So the idea that, yes, Qui-Gon makes a fairly complex wager and then he makes a side wager in order to get the hyperdrive and to get Anakin out of slavery. Well, that's fairly complex. Then we look at the idea that Anakin is building a secret pod that Watto doesn't know about, and he's 9, but he's built the whole thing, takes us a stretch beyond being mechanically savvy and into some other kind of territory here, which again strains credulity. And the thing that gets me is none of that was really necessary. There are a lot of other really simple ways to do the 2 things that the plot is trying to do in that section, which is introduce and free Anakin and give us a pod race. That's what we're trying to do in the middle of the film. And there were a lot of ways we could have gotten there, but the ways that we did get there were overly convoluted, complicated, clunky, slow the plot down, and don't really give us too much in the way of value. So I do think that section is a bit of a problem. I also think that there are 2 issues towards the end of the film, one of which is when we look at the idea that Queen Amidala has these handmaidens, and these handmaidens are sort of sometimes decoys for her, it is again a level of complexity that this movie simply doesn't need. And it does raise questions that we then get into later on. The prequels particularly liked doing this, which is to say, how much is the audience supposed to know about a character who is pretending to be something that they aren't? We do this all the time with Palpatine, whereby it is never entirely clear exactly at what point the audience is supposed to track that it is Darth Sidious or it is not. True fans know from the minute the character is introduced that, oh, Senator Palpatine, oh, he's going to be the Emperor. Whereas casual fans don't clock it till much later. So it becomes really unclear about that. But that really comes into play later in the prequels. For this one, for episode 1, it's like, we don't really need to do this stuff of saying now it's Padme, now it's Queen Amidala, and when is it one, when is it the other, and looking at that as we swap from Keira Knightley to Natalie Portman in a scene-by-scene basis. Again, it's just a level of complexity that isn't, I wouldn't say it's not necessary. It performs some functions for the story. I just think there were simpler ways to perform those functions.
Agreed.
Rather than these ways that we actually had here. So, and then the other thing that I want to talk about is this could be accused of, having a cake and eating it too. But I talked a lot about the fact that as a 12-year-old, I didn't have any problem with Jar Jar, which I don't, and I still don't to this day. However, I do see a larger macro problem with Jar Jar. if the prequels are going to include Anakin Skywalker's turn to the dark side and get into that incredibly dark territory, the character of Jar Jar Binks does not fit in that world. This is not a problem for episode 1 because we're not in that world yet, but it was quite jarring to see someone who is in this goofy slapstick world, and then to contrast that to what we'll see in episode 3 with Anakin burning alive on the side of a molten lava river on Mustafar.
He also hates Obi-Wan at that point too.
He does. But look, and that's something where Lucas has said, look, Jar Jar's role was always going to reduce as you work through the trilogy, which again, George Lucas being our unreliable relator, we don't know if that was true. This is a huge character in episode 1. So it does just raise some macro complications for me, saying, look, it's not actually a problem for this movie, but I think that it really could have been a pretty big problem for the prequels if that trajectory had have continued. I cannot imagine Anakin getting burned alive on Mustafar and also Jar Jar having lots of dialogue in that movie. Like, the two things don't go together for me. So it does just lead me to question and go, what was the overall mechanics here? What was the overall thought, you know?
And the internet as a wider whole has tried to reconcile that with jokes. Jar Jar's a secret Sith Lord and things like that, because whether they realize it or not, I think they see that incongruity as well. Whether they understand the mechanic of it that you've just explained or not, they go, this jigsaw puzzle piece doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Because in this movie, in the second movie, is it? He's the swing. He's the one who makes him Emperor.
It's the second movie.
So like, he's so little in that movie, but has such a pivotal piece. And it's like, they didn't need to use Jar Jar for that. Like, it's this weird kind of thing. You're right. It's a vibe that doesn't continue through.
Yeah. So, but otherwise, I also think that this movie, it's structurally sound. It's got some great thrilling action. I actually think the visual effects are better integrated than in episode 2 because we're shooting on film here. So while we have a huge amount of CGI and model work, we shouldn't discount the miniatures. There's a huge amount of miniature work in this movie. I really think that film grain over the top of the whole affair
grounds it a bit.
Actually kind of smooths this in and helps it integrate into the backgrounds a bit more. So the final thing I wanted to talk about, which has to come up in any conversation with any George Lucas Star Wars film, is revisions to the original print, right? Because again, we saw it at the cinemas, and you and I will probably have the same story where we wore the VHS tape out when we got it. So we're quite familiar with what this film looked like originally. And George Lucas does have that history of tinkering post-release and then releasing a new version. So this film is not immune to that. And the two biggest things that we see post-release that is now in the film is obviously Yoda was originally a puppet in the theatrical version of this movie. He is now a digital character, more on point with episodes 2 and 3, which would come later. And then the other thing that is the really big thing is that there is more of the pod race and more of the entrance to the pod race. Now, I don't have a list of changes in front of me. This is me more as a fan rather than anything else. But were there any other big George Lucas tinkerings that you know of from episode 1? Because they're the two that really stand out.
I wasn't thinking about it in this watch through. And I think he's been successful.
I was about to say, if you weren't thinking about it, he's succeeded.
Yeah. I do know those things. I'm like, oh yeah, he was a puppet. And yeah, the pod race is longer and more to it. But yeah, like, he's been successful in that revision. Because those versions, unless you have the VHSs and stuff, don't really exist in an easily accessible format. And he was very open about that. He's like, no, these are the movies I wanted originally. This is what's available. Yeah, I didn't think about it at the time watching it this time. I know I've had the discussions before. But yeah, these are now, because I've watched them so many times in this form, these are now the movie.
Oh, he would love to hear you say that, Ben. That is mission accomplished. Look, I would say, strangely enough, of all the things that he's revised in Star Wars, these are two fairly innocuous changes. And actually, I am in the camp of thinking that swapping out the Yoda puppet for the digital version is actually a win for this movie, because that Yoda puppet in episode 1 specifically did not look right because they were trying to...
It was too real almost.
Well, they were attempting to de-age Yoda.
Yeah.
And what they ended up doing was basically making the character something that wasn't familiar anymore. That mix of trying to de-age that character, basically audiences were like, that's not Yoda, and then they lost the spirit of the character there. So I do think making that change actually helped on a design front, as well as simply making the aesthetic of the thing fit more with the films that come immediately after that in the sequence of movies. So adding more to the pod race is like, whatever. I'm like, sure, I could take a couple extra minutes of pod race and some more flags at the start. That doesn't bother me.
I have a question for you, and this is my last question. We've now seen 2 of the more iconic songs at the end of movies in Star Wars. #Justice for Yub Nub. What do you think is a better ending song? The parade song in this movie, that kind of, as you said, diegetic kind of banger of a song, or Yub Nub from Return of the Jedi?
Look.
And if it's not Yub Nub, we'll have a question about our friendship.
Yeah, look, you've got to go Yub Nub, right? Because it's the OG.
#Justice for Yub Nub.
It's the OG. So that is something where, look, I am ride or die for Yub Nub, and I do think that that's just a good song. So if you're not sure what we're talking about, one of George Lucas's more controversial changes was he altered the ending celebration song that the Ewoks sing at the end of Return of the Jedi. The original song is affectionately known as Yub Nub because that seems to be what the Ewoks are singing when they're actually celebrating the fall of the Empire.
The Empire.
So, look, I do actually really like the celebration song.
It's a good song.
At the end of episode 1. And I actually think John Williams does a great job of building that, and then smashing us into credits. It really does take you out with a high to end the movie. So I'm here for it. I like it.
That brings up another thing I did think about while watching this movie. Star Wars has a smiling at each other at the end of movie problem.
It's not a problem. They love it, Ben. Okay, like they just love it. And
so weird.
I love it too. I'm just like, there's something about...
It's got to be deliberate, right?
End of New Hope, end of Return of the Jedi, and end of episode 1. It's just people smiling at each other and looking at the camera and loving life. And I just go, you know what? If you don't know how to end your movie,
that's it.
There are worse ways to end it than everyone's happy and giving each other a look of, we did it. You know, that's a good way to go, particularly in a Star Wars film. I'm here for it. I wish more films ended that way. I want The Godfather to end with, hey, we did it. And just smiling at each other while Yub Nub plays in the background. That, I think, would make Francis Ford Coppola's movie...
I think that's a YouTube series. Does Yub Nub make it better?
Does Yub Nub make it better?
So before we get into something I don't think Yub Nub will make better, let me tell you about where we can find our stuff. So Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. Find us on YouTube, Spotify, and iTunes. Type those words in. You will find all our previous podcasts. You will find our channels. You'll find our places where you can find what we do. When you do find what we do, we would really, really appreciate a like, a comment, and a subscribe. Let us know why you love Phantom Menace.
Don't get greedy, Ben. You want all 3. You want a like, a comment, and a subscribe? That's a lot.
All 3, and then I want you to grab a family member and make them do all 3.
And then I want you to take a selfie, smile at the camera, and end your movie and post it to social media.
Hey, if you want to take a selfie of you and your favorite piece of Star Wars merch and go # Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures,
no one is doing that.
Everyone is doing it, Jim. It's the craze for the kids right now. They're on the streets right now. We're saving a generation of children. Anyway.
TikToking up a storm with the Star Wars.
They're yub-nubbing down the street holding their lightsabers, man. It's the best. My dream world's the coolest.
I'm calling that like, subscribe, bump done.
If you want to follow us on any sort of social media, TikTok, Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures, Instagram, Jim_and_Ben. Now we got to talk about something serious.
Okay, I'm ready.
We've had this amazing conversation about Phantom Menace. We've talked about our love of Star Wars and how it shaped us. We've talked about how it shaped cinema. Earlier in this week, you hit me with an idea that chilled me to my core. It actually shooketh me. And it's because, and only because, you know how I feel about this. So I think I brought it up in a previous Star Wars podcast. The worst Star Wars movie, and I mean this by a country mile.
I still disagree with this.
It's not close. Canon Star Wars here is Attack of the Clones. Now, Jim disagrees with me greatly. And as a way that he thinks he can convince me otherwise, he's asked me, we've broken protocol here. He's asked me that I could pick Attack of the Clones as my next movie. But no, Jim's greedy. He wanted a little bit more. He wanted to give you, the audience, something special, and he wanted to punish me. So we're going to do something special for you. We're going to watch episode 2, Attack of the Clones. But we're going to be a lot more thorough. We're going to break this movie down, and I'm going to use your words, correct me if I'm wrong, scene by scene.
Absolutely.
So, I think you liking and subscribing is a great way to reward the effort I'm about to put into watching the worst Star Wars movie of all time. And when you tune in next podcast, I want you to hold a place in your heart, because I've been through something. Jim, do you have anything to say about what you've done?
I am so here for this. Scene at a time. I'm going to have a list. I am going to say, this happens, then this happens. It's going to be amazing.
So it turns out he's punishing you guys too, and I apologize.
Everyone's getting punished. Everyone, except me. I'm going to really enjoy this because I actually love talking, particularly about episode 2. There's a lot to say.
All of it is pretty awful.
Well, I disagree. So join us next time.
Week, Attack of the Clones scene by scene special at Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures.